Welcome. Tonight, we journey into the extraordinary life of one of history's most fascinating and complex figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on a remote island, he rose to become Emperor of the French and reshaped the world with sheer ambition, intellect, and iron will. His name became a symbol of both brilliance and destruction, a man who built an empire on the ruins of revolution and left behind a legacy that still echoes through the centuries. In this story, you'll discover the man behind the myth, his early years, his meteoric rise, the glory of Austerlitz, the burning of Moscow, the agony of Waterloo, and the lonely exile that followed. So get comfortable, let the noise of the day fade, and join us as we walk through history, through war, politics, passion, and power, in the footsteps of Napoleon Bonaparte. The shadow of a Kalasash was born on a small Mediterranean island, yet rose to dominate the European continent. A man of short stature but towering ambition, Napoleon Bonaparte rewrote the rules of warfare, politics, and power. He crowned himself emperor, defied kings and popes, and became both a revolutionary and a tyrant. His name inspired fear and admiration across empires. This is the full story, all its grandeur, complexity, and contradiction of Napoleon Bonaparte. In this documentary, we embark on a journey through 5 hours of riveting detail, from his humble beginnings in Corsica to his meteoric rise through the ranks of the French military, from his sweeping reforms and glory in battle to his devastating downfall and lonely death in exile, with vivid historical context, gripping accounts, and lesser-known facts. We present the definitive portrait of one of history's most enigmatic figures. Part 1. Corsica and the Making of a Revolutionary 1769 to 1785. Napoleon Bonaparte was born. Napoleon Bonaparte on August 15, 1769. In Ajaccio, Corsica, just months after the island was annexed by France. The Bonaparte family were minor Italian nobility of Tuscan descent, and Napoleon's upbringing was marked by political unrest and Corsican resistance to French control. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, aligned with the French authorities and secured a scholarship for Napoleon to attend the French Military Academy at Brienne-l'Aigle, TEO. As a young cadet, Napoleon was an outsider. He spoke French with a thick Corsican accent, and his provincial background made him a target of ridicule. But he was fiercely intelligent, with a voracious appetite for reading, particularly about history, philosophy, and military strategy. He admired classical leaders like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. These early influences would shape the audacious, relentless man he would become by age 16. He had completed his military education and became a second lieutenant in the French artillery, but the true beginning of his meteoric rise was just around the corner, ushered in by revolution. Part 2. The French Revolution and Napoleon's first taste of power, 1789-1795. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, when Napoleon was just 20 years old. The storming of the Bastille, the execution of King Louis XVI, and the radical reshaping of France created a power vacuum and unprecedented opportunities. While many nobles fled or were executed, Napoleon's star began to rise. He first gained national attention during the siege of Toulon in 1793. Royalist forces, aided by the British, had taken the city. Napoleon, then a captain, proposed a daring artillery strategy that led to the city's recapture. His success earned him a promotion to brigadier general at just 24. In 1795, Paris faced another threat: Royalist insurrection. Napoleon, now a general, was called upon to defend the revolutionary government. He famously repelled the attackers with a whiff of grapeshot, using cannons loaded with small iron balls to scatter the mob. This act cemented his reputation as a savior of the Republic and earned him command of the Army of Italy. This was the beginning of a series of military campaigns that would make him a legend. Part 3. The Italian Campaign and the Birth of a Legend, 1796 to 1797. Napoleon took command of the Army of Italy in 1796. What he found was a ragged, ill-supplied force, but in a matter of months he transformed them into a disciplined and victorious army. He applied innovative tactics, rapid movement, flanking maneuvers, and the use of terrain to his advantage. The Italian campaign was a masterclass in military genius. He defeated Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a series of dazzling victories: Montenotte, Lodi, Arcoli, Rivoli. Each battle enhanced his legend, more than just a general. Napoleon acted as a ruler in conquered territories, redrawing borders and installing puppet governments. He also engaged in a propaganda campaign, sending bulletins back to France, glorifying his exploits. He returned to Paris a hero, more popular than the government itself. Part 4. Egypt, Science and Strategy 1798-1799. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on a campaign in Egypt. His goal: to strike at British interests by threatening their route to India and to establish a French presence in the East. With him came not only soldiers, but also scientists, scholars, and artists, a mission that produced the description de l'Egypte and led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. The military campaign was mixed. He won the Battle of the Pyramids, defeating the Mamelukes, but the British fleet under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French navy at the Battle of the Nile, isolated and facing resistance. Napoleon left his army in Egypt and returned to France, where the political situation was once again unstable. Part 5. The coup of 18 Brumaire and rise to first consul, 1799 to 1804. Upon returning to France, Napoleon exploited the weak Directory government. In November 1799, he executed the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate. Napoleon named himself First Consul, effectively placing himself in control of the Republic. He introduced a new constitution, centralizing power. Under his leadership, France saw the implementation of wide-reaching reforms, reorganization of the administrative system, reconciliation with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, and the creation of the Napoleonic Coda Comprehensive, legal code that still influences many legal systems today. He also resumed military campaigns, defeating Austria at Marengo 1800 and securing France's dominance in Europe. But this was only the beginning. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, a symbolic act of independence from both Pope and tradition. Part 6. Emperor of the French and Master of Europe 1804–1807. Napoleon's coronation as emperor marked a new chapter in his quest for absolute power. He surrounded himself with a new nobility and court, blending revolutionary ideals with grandeur. His regime ushered in a period of remarkable transformation in French administration, economy, and education. He established the Bank of France, introduced the franc as currency, and expanded public education through the system. Militarily, Napoleon embarked on a series of campaigns that reshaped Europe. The War of the Third Coalition saw his greatest triumph at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, often cited as his tactical masterpiece. Facing the combined forces of Russia and Austria, Napoleon used deceptive maneuvers to lure the Allies into a trap and decisively crushed them. His victories led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, consolidating French dominance in Central Europe. However, these actions would also sow the seeds of future coalitions against him. Part 7. The Continental System and the Peninsular War 1807–1812. By 1807, Napoleon stood as the undisputed master of continental Europe. His armies had humbled Austria, defeated Prussia, and forced Russia into uneasy cooperation. But one enemy remained defiant: Great Britain. Unable to defeat the British at sea following the disastrous loss at Trafalgar in 1805, Napoleon pivoted to economic warfare. Thus, he established the Continental System, an ambitious embargo intended to cripple British trade by banning European countries under his influence from importing British goods. In theory, the strategy was clever. By choking Britain's economy, Napoleon hoped to bring it to its knees without ever needing to invade. In practice, however, the system was riddled with contradictions and loopholes. Smuggling became rampant, and the economies of French-allied nations suffered more than Britain's. Discontent simmered across Europe. Nowhere did the flaws of this policy become more apparent than in the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish quagmiring, 1807, Napoleon signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Spain to jointly invade Portugal, one of Britain's key allies. French troops were allowed to march through Spain to reach their target, but Napoleon had larger ambitions. Believing Spain weak and misgoverned, he betrayed his Spanish allies, forced King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to abdicate, and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. What followed was nothing short of disaster. The Spanish people rejected Joseph's rule. Across the country, spontaneous uprisings erupted. Monks, peasants, and townspeople, armed with little more than knives, muskets, and raw hatred, took to the streets. This resistance birthed one of the earliest examples of modern guerrilla warfare. The Peninsular War 1808–1814 became a bleeding wound for Napoleon. His armies, though skilled and professional, were ill-suited for a war of ambushes, sabotage, and ambivalent allies. The Spanish insurgents, supported by the British under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, inflicted heavy casualties and drained French resources. Cities like Saragossa and Madrid became battlefields of attrition. Even more damaging than the military losses was the symbolic blow. Napoleon, who once swept across Europe unopposed, now faced stubborn, chaotic resistance he could not stamp out. His image of invincibility was cracked. Portugal and British resistance Wellington's arrival in Portugal in 1808 marked another turning point. British forces were disciplined and strategically cautious, choosing favorable terrain to blunt French superiority. They entrenched themselves along the lines of Torres Vedras, massive defensive works that protected Lisbon and repelled repeated French attempts to take the city. Over the next few years, Wellington would lead a series of campaigns that slowly pushed the French out of Iberia. Napoleon was rarely present in person, delegating command to his marshals, many of whom failed to coordinate effectively or underestimated the determination of their enemies. Despite temporary victories, including at Oka and France's grip on Spain weakened year after year, the once loyal allies of the French Empire began to question their commitments. Fractures in the Empire by 1811, the signs of overreach were undeniable. Napoleon's empire spanned from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of Russia, but it was increasingly held together by force rather than loyalty. In Italy, in Germany, in the Netherlands, resentment simmered beneath the surface. His attempts to consolidate power through dynastic marriages and familial appointments were largely ineffective. Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia, none of Napoleon's brothers matched his genius or charisma. Their rule was often resented and short-lived. Furthermore, Napoleon's growing paranoia began to show. His censorship intensified, dissent was punished harshly, and even his allies began to fear his insatiable hunger for power. The Emperor of the French had created a vast empire, but it rested on fragile foundations. Napoleon and Marie-Louise. The midst of these crises, Napoleon sought to secure his legacy through marriage. His first wife, de Beauharnais, had failed to produce an heir. In 1810, he divorced her and married Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old daughter of the Austrian Emperor. The union was deeply symbolic. France and Austria, longtime enemies, now connected by blood. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to Napoleon II, the King of Rome. The event was celebrated across the empire. For a brief moment, it seemed the Bonaparte dynasty might endure beyond its founder, but storm clouds were gathering. The continental system had alienated allies. The Peninsular War was bleeding France white, and far to the east a bear stirred. In the cold prelude to the Russian campaign, Russia had been a reluctant partner ever since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Tsar Alexander I, originally dazzled by Napoleon, grew disillusioned by French economic domination and territorial aggression. The Russians quietly resumed trade with Britain, violating the continental system. Napoleon viewed this as treachery, determined to punish Alexander and reassert dominance. He began planning the most ambitious military campaign of his life, the invasion of Russia. Part 8. The Invasion of Russia. 1812. Napoleon's campaign against Russia in 1812 was the most ambitious and catastrophic military operation of his career. By now, his empire stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the gates of Moscow. But cracks were beginning to show. The continental system was failing. European nationalism was rising, and Tsar Alexander I had quietly resumed trade with Britain. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. War was inevitable to force Russia back into compliance and reaffirm French supremacy. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men from across his empire and allied states, Frenchmen, Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, and even reluctant Prussians and Austrians. It was the largest military force ever assembled in Europe up to that point. The invasion began in June 1812, crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon expected a swift and decisive campaign, perhaps one great battle to force a Russian surrender, but the Russians refused to meet him in open combat. Instead, they executed a scorched earth policy, retreating steadily while destroying crops, livestock, and infrastructure behind them. The Grande advanced deeper into Russia, but found nothing but burnt villages, parched land, and elusive enemies. The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, was the only major pitched battle of the campaign. It was one of the bloodiest days in military history, with over 70,000 casualties in a single day. Though the French technically won, the Russian army withdrew in good order. The path to Moscow was open, but at what cost? Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, expecting a surrender. Instead, he found an abandoned and silent city. Soon after his arrival, fires broke out, most likely set by Russian arsonists, consuming large parts of the city. Napoleon waited 5 agonizing weeks for a Russian emissary who never came. With winter approaching and supplies dwindling, Napoleon finally ordered a retreat in October 1812. The return march became a nightmare. Temperatures plunged, reaching -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Horses died by the thousands. Men froze in their sleep or starved. Constant harassment by Cossack, cavalry, and guerrilla. Attacks turned the retreat into a rout. By the time the remnants of the Grande recrossed into Poland in December, only around 100,000 men remained. Some estimates suggest as few as 10,000 soldiers were still fit for duty. The Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's invincible image. Europe was stunned by the scale of the disaster. Former allies began plotting his downfall, sensing weakness, and for Napoleon the worst was yet to come. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and others now gathered to take down the emperor. Yet even after the Russian catastrophe, Napoleon would not go quietly. As 1813 dawned, he began raising new armies and preparing for a series of desperate, heroic battles in the heart of Europe. The empire had cracked, but it had not yet fallen. Part 9. The War of the Sixth Coalition and the Fall of Paris, 1813 to 1814. Following the disastrous retreat from Russia, Europe sensed its moment. A new and formidable alliance. The Sixth Coalition rose with one shared goal: to bring down Napoleon. Once and for all, comprising Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and a number of German states, the coalition represented a convergence of long-held grudges, newly emboldened powers, and the opportunity to topple the dominant force on the continent. Napoleon, despite losing most of his Grande, refused to yield. By early 1813, he was already rebuilding his forces, drawing on conscripts and veterans alike. Within a few months, he fielded new armies totaling over 400,000 troops. It was a testament to his organizational genius and sheer force of will. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon launched a campaign in Germany to push back the Allies. He won several battles, including the Battle of Lutzen and Battle of Botzen, demonstrating that he was still a formidable commander. But these victories were costly and failed to deliver a decisive blow. His enemies were learning, adapting, and growing in confidence. By the autumn, Austria formally joined the war against him. The coalition's military leadership, especially Prince Karl Schwarzenberg, General Blücher, and Tsar Alexander, developed a new approach. Avoid direct confrontation with Napoleon himself. Instead, target his marshals, stretch his supply lines, and drain French manpower. The climactic confrontation came in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 600,000 soldiers clashed over for days. Largest battle in European history before World War I, Napoleon was outnumbered and increasingly isolated. His German allies, especially Saxony, began to defect. Eventually, the French army was overwhelmed and forced to retreat westward. It was a decisive coalition victory. The loss at Leipzig marked the beginning of the end. France's allies fell. Away, the French economy was unraveling, morale was collapsing, and calls for peace intensified. Still, Napoleon refused to abdicate. In early 1814, coalition forces invaded France itself. For months, Napoleon fought a brilliant, stubborn campaign in the 6 Days Campaign, where he outmaneuvered larger armies, winning tactical victories at battles such as Montmirail and Camp Hobart. But the math was against him. The Allies simply had more men, more money, and momentum. By March 1814, Paris was under threat. Napoleon rushed to defend it, but was too late. On March 31st, Allied forces entered the city. Paris had fallen for the first time in centuries. The French Senate turned against him. Marshals began to lose faith. Under immense pressure, Napoleon finally abdicated on April 6, 1814. He attempted to name his young son, Napoleon II, as his successor, but the Allies rejected this. Napoleon was exiled to the tiny island of Elba off the Italian coast. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor, but now of a mere scrap of land. From the master of Europe to ruler of a Mediterranean rock, his downfall was staggering. And yet the story was not over. Not for Napoleon, not yet. Part 10. The 100 Days and the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte might have seemed finished. The mighty emperor of the French reduced to ruling a rocky island of just 12,000 inhabitants. Europe reshaped itself without him. But Napoleon, ever the strategist, ever the believer in destiny, was not content to fade away quietly. His exile was lenient. He retained the title of emperor, was given a personal guard, and was allowed a small navy. But he also had time to plan, to listen, and to watch the political winds shift in France. And those winds were changing. Back in France, the Bourbon monarchy, restored in the form of King Louis XVIII, was struggling. The king was unpopular, seen as a symbol of the old regime, out of touch with the revolutionary ideals that had once stirred the nation. The soldiers of the former grande were resentful. The peasants grumbled. The people remembered the glory Napoleon had once brought. Whispers grew, could the emperor return? In February 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon made his move. Escaping Elba with just a few hundred men, he landed in southern France near Cannes. As he marched north toward Paris, the royal troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. Legend has it that when he confronted a battalion on the road, he stepped forward and declared, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." No one fired. By the time he reached Paris on March 20th, 1815, Napoleon was back in power without firing a single shot. Thus began the period known as the 100 Days. The Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were stunned, but they did not hesitate. They quickly declared him an outlaw and vowed to crush him once and for all. As Napoleon rallied the French army and reorganized his government, his enemies prepared for war. This time, Napoleon knew he could not wait. He had to strike before the coalition fully mobilized. His target, Belgium, where British and Prussian forces under the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher were gathering. If he could defeat them separately before they joined forces, he might yet regain control of Europe. In June 1815, Napoleon led his newly rebuilt army, about 125,000 strong, into Belgium. His plan was bold and aggressive: divide the enemy and conquer them in detail. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussians at Ligny, inflicting heavy losses. But a separate engagement at Quatre Bras failed to stop Wellington from withdrawing in good order. Then came June 18th, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. It had rained the night before, turning the fields south of Brussels into muddy, sodden terrain. Napoleon delayed his attack until midday, hoping the ground would dry. It was a crucial mistake. The battlefield was divided among key positions: the Hougemont farm, the fortified farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, and the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean. Where Wellington deployed his Anglo-Allied forces, the French launched wave after wave of assaults. Marshal Ney, leading the cavalry, charged repeatedly, often without infantry or artillery support, failing to break the British lines. Throughout the day, Wellington's forces held firm, repelling the French with disciplined volleys and bayonet charges. Napoleon committed his elite Imperial Guard, his last reserve, as they marched forward grim, silent, the symbol of Napoleonic might. They met a storm of fire from British and Allied troops. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. At that moment, the Prussians arrived. Blücher's army, battered but determined, surged onto Napoleon's right flank, sealing his fate. The French lines collapsed. The once mighty Grande disintegrated into chaos and retreat. Napoleon fled the battlefield. Waterloo was a catastrophe. He had gambled everything and lost. Back in Paris, he tried to rally political support, but it was over. On June 22nd, 1815, just days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He hoped to escape to America, but the British Navy closed off the ports rather than fall into enemy hands on land. Napoleon surrendered himself to the captain of the British ship HMS Bellerophon, hoping for leniency. But Britain had no intention of risking a third comeback. They exiled him again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, in the South Atlantic Ocean, over 1,200 miles from the nearest land. There would be no escape from this final exile. Napoleon's reign was truly over, but his legend, that was just beginning. Part 11. Exile and Death on St. Helena 1815 to 1821. After his catastrophic defeat at Waterloo and his second abdication, Napoleon Bonaparte's once glorious saga entered its final, most isolated chapter. This time there would be no dramatic return, no armies to rally, no stage upon which to perform the role of emperor. His destination was far removed from Europe, politics, and history itself. The remote island of St. Helena, located in the desolate South Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,200 miles from the nearest mainland. St. Helena was an inhospitable speck of volcanic rock controlled by the British. Wind-swept cliffs rose from the crashing surf, shrouded in fog and battered by salty winds. The island was deliberately chosen for its isolation. There would be no Elba-style escape here. Napoleon arrived aboard the HMS Northumberland in October 1815. His entourage was small, just a handful of loyal followers, including generals, a valet, and a few staff. He was placed under the supervision of Sir Hudson Lowe, the British-appointed governor whose rigid and often antagonistic attitude would turn Napoleon's exile into a prolonged struggle of wills. His new residence, Longwood House, sat atop a windswept plateau. Originally built as a farm, it was damp, mouldy, infested with rats, and constantly plagued by cold winds and fog. The emperor, the man who once dined in palaces and commanded empires, now lived in a decaying cottage surrounded by guards, his movements watched at all times. At first, Napoleon tried to recreate a semblance of court life. He rose late, took long walks, engaged in philosophical discussions, dictated his memoirs, and studied history. He often reflected on past battles, commented on political affairs in Europe, and justified his reign. His followers called this the Second Empire, not of land and soldiers, but of memory, ideology, and legacy. But the harsh conditions, combined with the deep emotional wound of defeat and exile, wore him down. His once rigid discipline eroded. He grew lethargic, depressed, and physically frail. Letters home were censored. His library was limited. Tensions with Governor Lowe escalated to petty hostilities. Lowe restricted access to newspapers, delayed deliveries of personal items, and made visitation difficult. Despite the degradation of his surroundings, Napoleon continued to write and speak of his ideas. He cast himself as a martyr of history, a visionary, betrayed by monarchs and misunderstood by the world. He famously said, "What a novel my life has been! It was a calculated act of myth-making, one that would shape how future generations saw him." By 1817, his health began to deteriorate. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, fatigue, and episodes of vomiting. British doctors were called in, but their diagnoses varied, and treatments were primitive. Many now believe he suffered from stomach cancer, possibly hereditary. Others speculated about poisoning, theory that still stirs debate today due to high arsenic levels later found in his hair, though this may have come from environmental exposure. As months passed, his physical decline accelerated. By early 1821, he was bedridden. In April, he dictated his final will and messages. He asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, near the French people he had loved so much. His last days were marked by fever, delirium, and mutterings of past victories. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. His last reported words were, "France, army, head of the army, a fragmented echo of the life he had once commanded. He was buried on St. Helena in a simple grave shaded by willow trees. No name was inscribed, only "Here lies." In 1840, his body was returned to France by order of King Louis Philippe, where it was received with immense ceremony. Today, Napoleon rests beneath the grand dome of Les Invalides in Paris. His sarcophagus, encircled by statues of victory and carved eagles, though exiled and defeated in life's final act, in death Napoleon became immortal. His legend grew even. As his body faded into history, to monarchs he was a tyrant, to romantics a tragic hero, to revolutionaries a symbol of possibility. No man in modern history rose so high, fell so far, or etched himself so deeply into the collective memory of the world. From Corsican obscurity to Emperor of the French, from the glory of Austerlitz to the cold isolation of St. Helena, Napoleon's story is one of brilliance, ambition, and the enduring power of legacy. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte's story is unlike any other in modern history, a tale of ambition, brilliance, conquest, downfall, and legacy, from the windswept hills of Corsica to the throne of the French Empire, from the thunder of Austerlitz to the snows of Russia, and finally to the lonely exile on St. Helena. His life unfolded like a grand epic. He was a man of contradictions, a champion of revolutionary ideals who crowned himself emperor, a liberator to some, a tyrant to others. He brought sweeping reforms to the lands he conquered: legal codes, centralized governance, meritocracy, but he also brought war, devastation, and domination. To his soldiers, he was the little corporal beloved, inspiring, almost mythical. To monarchs, he was a threat to the old order. To the people of France, he was both a symbol of national pride and a source of immense suffering. And to history, he remains a subject of endless debate, fascination, and study. His military genius reshaped the art of war. His political reforms reshaped the structure of modern government. Even his failures, Russia, Leipzig, Waterloo, nations how to confront power, and how empires, no matter how mighty, are never invincible. More than 2 centuries after his death, Napoleon's name still commands attention. His image still appears in books, films, and classrooms. His campaigns are still studied in military academies, and his legacy, woven with glory, ambition, tragedy, and enduring myth, remains carved into the very foundation of modern Europe. In the end, Napoleon was not simply a conqueror of territory. He was a conqueror of time, his influence echoing long after his empire fell. As he once said, "Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." He died defeated, but his story lives on.